Hello there, everyone. My name is Teresa McCloy, and you're listening to episode 182 of the Real Life Process podcast. It is so great to be back with you each and every week as we talk about all things in our real life and listening in as we share tips and stories and practical action steps that we hope will lead you to living from rest, not rush. And we have been walking through the actual 4 components of the process on the podcast the last few episodes. We started about 5 or 6 episodes ago, actually with some of the pre-work of the real life process, the needs and values, talking about the Enneagram and mind mapping and all the tools that we use. And it's also when we launched our brand new YouTube channel where you can actually watch the podcast live on video. So if you haven't hopped on over to the YouTube channel, we would love to have you do that. Even if live video is not your thing, we would just love your support. Subscribe to the channel. It will help us as we build out on that platform. So we appreciate you all so much. Some of you have been faithful listeners to the podcast for a really long time. So whether you're a brand new listener or you've been with us for a long time, welcome to the Real Life Process community. We have so many wonderful things coming up in the next few months that myself and my team are preparing for, and we cannot wait to release out the book that we have coming out this fall. We're going to be hosting a facilitator retreat this fall. We're going to be hosting a release party for the book. We'll have a launch team for the book. We just have so many great things coming up in the next few months as we continue to grow and expand here at the Real Life Process. But on today's episode, we're actually going to be wrapping up the very last component of the process. And we have been walking through step by step all of the 4 components. And like I said, the pre-work, some of the tools that we use in the pre-work as well. And we have walked through the component of the real life being, defining what matters in your life and creating that personal real life view document. And we have that as a free download actually with that episode. So you might want to go back a few episodes and listen into that one. Then we went into the second component, which is real life action, creating a 90-day actionable projects around those things that matter to you. Once you've defined them, how do we move them forward? How do we grow in those? And then we looked on last week's episode at real life time. How do I order and align my days so that each day really does matter? It gets me where I want to go. And it's an extraordinary day that I don't miss the moments that are in the day. So I would encourage you to go back and listen to those episodes as well and look at those episodes and listen in to what those have for you as well. But on today's podcast, we are going to look at this very last component, this component of what we call real life living. And to me, this is the key, is learning to order your life with the rhythms, routines, and behaviors of rest, renew, and review. And I want to just share with you today as we go through this, just a little bit of backstory of why this component matters to me so much. And I'm going to share just a little bit actually from the new book that's coming out this fall. I am a person who has always been driven to how do I get the most out of life? That's just part of my DNA, part of my makeup and how God wired me. But so I really became probably in my early 20s, pretty addicted to any type of self-help books, anything that would help me do more. I subscribed to Zig Ziglar's program and to John Maxwell's program. I was a part of the CD club from John Maxwell back in the day, and I would get a CD every month from his program. So I've done a lot of that type of work of just how do I get the most out of every single day. And as I grew up in a very loving family. My mother was a teacher. My father was a farmer. And so we were very geared to work and, just hardcore work. My mom often spent late nights grading papers. She was an English teacher, so a lot of essays and writing. And my father worked many long hours, just like my husband does. Even right now, as I'm recording this episode, we are in a very busy season of spring planting of the corn and the beans and be harvesting the wheat and the hay. We live on a working grain farm. So work and that work ethic has always been something that I've had instilled in me from a very, very young age. And my brother and I both learned that. And our spouses often tease us of how, we just don't know how to rest. And I would say that was very, very true for me. And about 10 years ago, when we were in, for our family, one of the most difficult times that we have ever experienced, and when I was working full-time in ministry, my husband full-time in farming, raising a junior high girl and a young adult son who was actually struggling quite a bit at that point with his addictive behaviors and the experimenting with drugs and alcohol and all the things that he was walking in. And I realized as I began to attend a ministry program called the Transforming Center, and I began to go on these quarterly retreats, that I was craving rest. And I really didn't know how to live in a season of rest or in a place of rest. I didn't know how to step out of that work mode and that drivenness. And I was feeding my mind with, for years, for my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, if I just figure out how to do more or how to organize my days in time management or all of these things, that I'll get it, that I'll finally get it. And it wasn't till I began to attend these quarterly retreats that I realized that I had as many of the coping behaviors around work and drivenness that my son did in what he was walking through with his own addictions to drugs and alcohol. And that's not easy for me to say and admit. I've talked about it several times. I talk about when I speak, but it's difficult to say that, I felt like I was actually a workaholic and that I was using it in so many ways. So this fourth component of learning to order our life with rhythms and routines of rest and renew and review are, to me, what makes the rest of the real life process, the other three components, sustainable. Because once we know ourselves, and then once we decide this is how I want to move forward, these are the things that matter to me, and I do want to keep growing. I do want to keep achieving things. I do want to keep spiritually growing and growing in my relationships. And I want to have days that are meaningful. But that in itself can push me, and it might push you as well, to a place where you never step up on the balcony, you never step back and rest and renew and review. So if you're visually looking at our logo of the triangle, we always draw it with 3 arrows around it as well, because it's not just about those 3 components. It's actually about the sustainability. The 3 arrows represent this idea of, I also need to rest. I also need to renew myself in renewal. And I also need to review. And you notice even that the arrows are turning against the normal way. They're going opposite of what they normally would. Just that idea of slowing down, not speeding up. There's so much I could say about rest and how we lean into it. But for today's episode, I just want to break down the idea of these 3 R's of, once we know the areas that matter to us, our needs and our values. Once we know how we're going to put those into 90-day actionable steps, and we've broken those down, the projects for the next 90 days, for the next season. And then once we've looked at our calendar and our time, then we want to, in a sustainable pattern, come apart for a while on a regular basis. I love the quote from Dallas Willard that says, if you don't come apart for a while, you will come apart after a while. And that's exactly what began to happen in my own life. And maybe you've had those seasons as well, is it almost maybe we get forced to come apart, maybe from something physical that happens and our body just says, I need to shut down. Or our mind says, I need to shut down. Or we pay attention to our emotions and they say, oh my gosh, I've had enough. I need to step back. I need to come apart for a while. If we can build in regular rhythms and routines and behaviors around rest, renew, and review, then these components that we've put together, this new modern day rule of life is sustainable. So let's look at these 3 R's, and then I'm going to encourage you to think through them and say, which one am I missing? What small step could I take in one of these 3 R's? So let's first define what rest is. Rest is really taking 8, 10, 12, 24 hours away and setting it aside and saying, in this day, I am going to rest. Maybe it means for you, rest is spending time with other people in relationship. Maybe it's spending time alone with God. Maybe it's an 8, 10, 12-hour break from screen time. In our culture and in our society, we spend so much time in front of a screen, whether that be our phone that we're on and we're kind of addicted to, whether that be a computer that we're using, a TV that we're watching, this idea that we need to be on technology. I know for me, as I live life on the farm, when I can get out and just sit outside, be in the sun, get that vitamin D, work in my garden, do something physical, go for a walk, go for a hike, whatever it might be, that is so restful and can be. Richard Rohr has a quote that says, taking life at 2 miles an hour. Let me say that again. A quote that says, taking life at 2 miles an hour, just slowing down. Now, practically, that might mean either you're maybe even preparing for this day ahead of time. What are we going to eat today? Do I want to prepare food? Do I not want to prepare food? From a spiritual place, many people would refer to this as the Sabbath day. So you get to decide what your boundaries are and what this looks like as a Sabbath day, as a day of rest, an invitation to take a nap, an invitation to watch a good movie, an invitation to go for a long drive in a car, or for a long lingering dinner, or a meal around the table. What would it look like for you to rest? Now, I know for myself, I was pulled into letting go of rest a lot because of how I'd grown up, because of work that I was doing 15 to 20 years ago in ministry. So Sunday was not a day of rest. So it was hard for me to set that aside. And even in your work schedule, you may have to decide what is your day of rest. It may not be Sunday. It may be a totally different day that you're leaning into. It might be in the middle of the week, depending on your work schedule. So what would a day of rest look like for you? And you may have to start small with just 6 to 8 hours and then build up to how would that be if I rested from, say, noon on a certain day till noon the next day? What would that look like for you with your work schedule, with how you're leaning in? If you work for yourself as an entrepreneur or you own your own business, then you can do some adjustments maybe within your schedule to work in this day of rest. The more you get into the process, we also encourage you to take a day of rest, not only once a week, but also a couple of days every 90 days or so, about every 3 months, to step out of the everyday ordinary life, get up on the balcony. And we call that a 90-day reset, but it leans into this rhythm of rest and retreat. And, how can that feed your mind, your body, and your soul? So that's the first R, is just beginning to schedule a day of rest to help keep this sustainable. Also, a day of renewal. Now, renewal is different than rest because renewal is super purposeful. We are deciding to engage in something new for this particular day. What do I love to do? For me, this was really hard in the beginning because I didn't have a lot of hobbies as a kind of a workaholic person. I've had to look for things that I enjoy doing that are renewing to me. So if you're always in front of technology, maybe it is getting outside into a hobby, golfing or running or something maybe that's a physical activity. I love working in my garden. I'm really on a path to begin to work with wildflowers and grow wildflowers. And I really love the beauty of fresh flowers. I also love music. So for me, music is a hobby. And I'm trying, even in this 90 days, coming up to schedule more time to just sit down at my piano and play and re-engage my brain differently. So that's on one of my 90-day projects as I come into this new one, is how can I engage music in my life as a hobby? So many times this renewal is around something that you enjoy doing. But for me, it's also absolutely no work. No work comes on renewal day. Often in my own life, it looks like a Friday night date night with my husband into a Saturday with a white space, lots of margin, nothing scheduled on my Saturday, and just allowing what comes to come. And then I move into a day of rest. And then usually by 4 or 5 in the afternoon, I'm moving into what I call the last R, which is what we call review. So first we rest, we renew. Many times those 2 days are back to back. We call them the weekend, and they're stepping away out of our normal everyday routine into something that looks different. Day of renewal, day of rest. And then for me, as I come into Sunday evening, is when I love to do a time of weekly review. Now, when we work with other clients and even many of our facilitators and coaches, they do their weekly review maybe on Friday evening. They do their weekly review on Saturday morning. Some people incorporate their spouse or even their entire family into their weekly review time. But this idea of pausing for 45 minutes to an hour and setting aside the time to review your projects that you're working on this 90 days, to review your calendar for the next couple of weeks, to even set maybe possibly in a spiritual time with God of what went well this week. What do I want to look back on? In spiritual practices, that's often called an examine. What do I want to examine for my life and carry forward? And what do I want to take away and move into what's coming? So looking back and looking forward in a review. A time set aside to just be still and reconnect. I love to encourage our clients that are working in the process to read through their real life view document. It's why we want to make it just 2 pages, reading through the side that reminds you of your needs and your values and your areas of focus and your purpose statement, your real life view statement. What does that look like? What are the things that I'm good at? Reminding myself of those things. Where do I want to live into how I was created? And then flipping that document over and saying, and here's the things I'm moving forward with right now. I don't need to be overwhelmed by all these areas of focus. I'm being very purposeful around these projects with these people right now. And this is how I'm calendaring my days. I love the Real Life View document for that purpose. It's a map and a guide and a compass for you. And if you'll read through it in a weekly review time, I can almost guarantee you it will help you to not live with your hair on fire. You'll feel very purposeful. You'll feel very committed to the rule of life that you've created. So these 3 R's, this rest, this renew, this review, these 3 R's can help us to sustain on a regular basis how we're living into the real life process. Now, we do deeper reviews when we do a 90-day reset and up on the balcony. We can put in a longer time of renewal at those times as well. I love what one of our facilitators says in the new book that we have this fall. It says, it really is easy to drift if we do not live this precious life with intentionality. Instead, we run the risk of waking up 10 years later and wondering where our life has gone without any real movement or change. I just love that idea of thinking about, where do I want to be? What would I want to be doing 10 years from now? And how do I get there? How do I get to a different place a year from now? And we do it through a process. And we have a process going on in our lives, whether we've done it with intention or we haven't. Your life is being lived out, and there's a process happening. And I know for most of you listening, you want it to be with intention and you want it to be with growth. So those are the 4 components of the process: real life being, real life action, real life time, and real life living. Sustaining it, resting, renewing, and reviewing. We're going to wrap up next week's episode with the practices that are behind the process. But I hope you'll go back and you'll download the different downloads that we've had, put it all together, begin to form out your real life view document so that you have your map, your compass to guide you as well. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Real Life Process. We have had so much fun just in the last few episodes walking through everything, the signature content of the process, and giving you the framework that will help you develop your unique modern day rule of life. There's self-discovery, there's 90-day projects, time management, and next week we're going to be talking about the spiritual practices that are also behind the process. So it is a blast to help you create your most extraordinary life. And remember that every day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for it. We'll be back next week with more from the Real Life Process podcast.